So let's address some of the stigma. Uh, First of all, there's this argument that pornography is involved usually in AGP identification or ideation. And my own reading of experiences of AGP is that, yeah, porn usually shows up, it plays a role, but you never know where it's coming from. There was an unfortunate kid on the GenSpect podcast a couple of months ago uh, who said that his trigger was watching a Jack Black movie. I mean, come on. Anything can cause this ideation. Okay, so porn plays a role, but there is the argument that porn uh, consumption will affect the brain, that it will change the male brain. What do you say to people who wave, a study um, and say that porn consumption affects the brain, for example? What response do you have to that argument?
Uh, so let's back up a little. First, um, pornography figures in the large majority of male sexuality in the sense that they sometimes view pornography. You know, most straight men view some straight pornography. Uh, either a heterosexual couple having very graphic sex or perhaps two women having sex. The large majority of gay men uh, use pornography occasionally, featuring men having sex with each other. Uh, do we think that gay men become gay, say, because they view gay pornography? I don't. Our does when I was a kid, uh, we didn't have the internet, but I certainly at some point saw Playboy centerfolds, which I found pretty sexy and I guess sexually arousing. Did that make me straight? I don't think that's the way it worked. People have these sexual interests and they uh, kind of select into the kind of pornography that they like based on their sexual interests. And that is recently we have unpublished data. This is a study I actually conducted in collaboration with Phil Illy and somebody else uh, survey. And we ask about the genre sissy hypnoporn, which seems to be, uh, uh, one of the, I guess the pornography that is alleged to cause autogynephilia in some cases. And uh, among the uh, men in our sample, or the persons, the males who identified as autogynephilic, well, yeah, a lot of them, most of them had viewed sissy hypnoporn and found it, somewhat uh, arousing, but not, tremendously so. Uh, but on average, they had experienced autogynephilia about 5 years before they ever saw any of this kind of porn.
My guest today is Dr. John Michael Bailey, Northwestern professor of psychology, and one of the few experts in the sexology field who had ever even written about autogynephilia before the present transgender craze. Dr. Bailey, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Bailey, let's just start with a definition for those who don't know, because some of our listeners are new and they may be new to the word. What is autogynephilia?
It is a very weird concept, a very weird uh, experience that uh, people should not expect to understand well without a fair amount of study. But autogynephilia is a natal males, who are mostly men, a man's sexual arousal by the fantasy of being a woman. Autogynephiles are males who typically are adolescent or you know older, who experience a lot of sexual arousal by imagining themselves as women, but also by imitating women. The most common early experience of males with autogynephilia is um, putting on women's clothing, particularly, at least in the early stages, lingerie, panties, bra, and so on, which is sexually arousing. And they often look at themselves in the mirror and masturbate. Um, Autogynephilia begins on average in early to mid adolescence, same as heterosexuality and homosexuality. Autogynephilia can be thought of as an unusual form of male heterosexuality. Men with men and adolescent boys with autogynephilia are attracted to women primarily, including women in the real world, but they are also attracted to this image of themselves as a woman, and they uh, will often create a woman in quotes inside themselves that they are sexually aroused by.
This is my understanding from your book. You argue that there are, per Blanchard, that there are two basic types of transsexual. There are the homosexuals who want to attract men by becoming women, supposedly. And then there are the autogynephiles or AGPs. So these are two different types of transsexual that are discrete in their etiology, is my understanding. Do I have that correct?
We're talking about natal males, people born male, biological males, genetic males. Yes, Blanchard did a great deal of scientific work in the 1980s and 90s that I think convincingly showed that there were two main types, maybe only two types. He only found evidence for two types of men who become women, and one of them can be thought of as an extremely feminine form of gay man. And most of them probably went through a stage where they tried being gay men, but they decided that they wanted to transition to becoming a trans woman, which is different than a woman. It's trans woman. And then the other kind, but by the way, all of that type, which is Blanchard called the homosexual male to female transsexual, all that type is exclusively, unambiguously attracted to men. They only like men sexually. And they were uh, feminine from early in life. Usually, as soon as they had behavior, they were seen as being extremely feminine, uh, And they are not at all sexually aroused by the idea of being a woman, although they sometimes are sexually aroused by the idea of being a woman with a man because that's what they want. They want men. Um, the second type, which Blanchard called non-homosexual male to female transsexuals, comprised all transsexuals that he saw at the Clark Institute Gender Identity Clinic, where he worked at the time. These were men seeking sex reassignment surgery that would be paid for by the state of Ontario. The second type comprised all men who were not exclusively attracted to men. And the largest subgroup were those exclusively attracted to women. A second subgroup said that they were bisexual. They were attracted both to men and to women. But in a moment, I hope I will remember to explain why I think they're not bisexual in all deep definitions. And the third described themselves as asexual because they said they were not attracted to other people. So autogynephilia is what they had in common. Blanchard decided, and in part, he devised a scale, the core autogynephilia scale. Example item: I have been sexually aroused by imagining myself as a woman. Uh, but there are 8 items, and anyway, the three non-homosexual subtypes, that is heterosexual, bisexual, and asexual, all had elevated scores on the core autogynephilia scale. And Blanchard's explanation of the three subtypes are that heterosexual, that is, the ones who are attracted both to women in the world, but also autogynephilic, that their inversion of their sexual attraction, which causes autogynephilia, was incomplete and still allowed external attraction to women. Bisexual autogynephilia was attributed to an interesting phenomenon whereby a subgroup of autogynephiles are sexually aroused by the idea of having sex with a man as a woman, because we think this really resonated with their image of themselves as a woman. And I think it's not what I would consider true bisexuality, in the sense that they really are not aroused by the male body. You can show them, you know, pictures of very attractive nude men, and it doesn't do anything for them. It's it's being desired by a man that is really gratifying to them, as well as uh, being seen as a woman enough to have for a man to have sex with them. And then the final subset, the asexual autogynephiles, the idea is that the inversion of their heterosexuality. So they start like heterosexual men in development, let's say, but their sexual desire for women is completely inverted inside the self, so that they are only able to feel this sexual attraction for the inverted self as a woman. It is so complete that it leaves no sexual attraction to people in the real world.
I've
So yeah,
I've seen this referred to as pseudo bisexuality. Is that what you're
the
talking?
the second, this, yes, bisexual autogynephiles, Ray Blanchard called them pseudo bisexuals, and I think that that is that is an apt description. Phil Illy, the autogynephilic book author, calls it meta attraction, which I get, but I don't like, I guess, changing perfectly good terminology. And so I'm going to say pseudo bisexuality.
So let's catch up to the present day from 2003 when your book, The Man Who Would Be Queen, was published to great controversy. And you received no small measure of harassment and attacks for that, for bringing out the issue of autogynephilia. Um, and of course, you wrote some controversial things about the homosexual transsexuals as well. So let's sort of focus on that and leave aside, the dildo machine. That's one of the controversies you've written about already. So I'll link to it for those listeners who are interested. Um, and let's sort of focus on the AGPs because, and people with trans identities, quote unquote. How much work have you done with this population since the book was published? What kind of work have you done? Have you done therapy, studies, surveys, and so on? And so you've expanded your knowledge base of these people, I would expect.
Yeah, I have continued to study autogynephilia, and with my ex-graduate student Kevin Sue, uh, with whom I think virtually all of my autogynephilia research has been co-authored. We are the most active groups studying autogynephilia. I think we've made a lot of progress in finding interesting things out about autogynephilia. I would say most of our work has involved surveys. That's how we've collected the data. But we actually, this was before Kevin worked with me. I have done one study uh, where we actually measured sexual arousal patterns of the two types of male to female transsexuals using uh, genital arousal assessment instruments. And because they were post-operative, we used something called a vaginal photoplethysmograph, and we looked to see whether uh, the extent to which they had they were more aroused by males or females, and we found that those who we believe were autogynephilic were more aroused by females, and the other type more aroused by males. Also, with Kevin Sue, we did a genital arousal study of autogynephilic male cross-dressers. So they were not they had not obtained sex reassignment surgery. They still were intact males, and so we uh, uh, studied them, and we found that also they were most aroused by female stimuli. But we found something pretty interesting in that study, that we had a third unusual kind of sexual stimulus, which were visual, audio-visual erotica. It's basically pornography featuring. Uh, I'm this word is controversial, but probably not with your audience, so I'm just going to say it. She-males. She-males are uh, natal males who they're trans women who have gotten breast implants, but who still retain their penises. And it turns out that attraction to she-males, arousal by she-male stimuli, is common among autogynephiles. And we showed that in this study, and that's interesting. I think it's attributable to their being aroused by, um, again, this internalized arousal to trans and female images.
I am reminded actually of Mr. Jamie Shoup, uh, uh, who got very angry at a bunch of people in the gender critical movement and sent them some nasty emails a while back that had all of these images of like pregnant she-male kangaroos. I mean, just very, very strange imagery. Um, to the point that, the obscenity is like less affecting than the what factor. There's something very strange going on in the brain of that person. It's very difficult to understand.
Yeah, I think Jamie Shoup is an unusual person, and I'm not sure that all of uh, his issues, or he has retransitioned tough. Uh, I'm not sure all of them are explicable by autogynephilia. In fact, I don't think they are, because uh, I know uh, I have interacted with lots of autogynephilic persons, and few of them are as unusual uh, in sometimes unhinged kinds of ways as Jamie Shoup seems to be.
Yes, for what it's worth, I do believe he's had a fair amount of psychiatry from the Department of Veterans Affairs. In The Man Who Would Be Queen, you write that nearly all the homosexual transsexuals I know work as escorts after they have their surgery. I used to think that somehow they had no other choice because conventionally happy lives were beyond their grasp. I have come to believe that these transsexuals are less constrained by their secret pasts than by their own desires. And these desires, including the desire for sex with different attractive men, do not make conventional married life easier. Um, that's one of the things that certain people did not like about your book. And it does seem to reinforce the popular impression that I get today, that people get today, that this Venn diagram of trans women are women and sex work is work, that's a circle, right? That Venn diagram is a circle. So, in the years since you wrote this controversial passage, have you been able to correct for any selection biases, et cetera, and figure out what percentage of the homosexual transsexual population actually is involved in prostitution?
I have had no great reason to correct what I wrote before. Um, I never said that all homosexual male and female transsexuals were um, sex workers, just that
Right. You said
many
nearly
or
all.
most, yeah. And I had conducted a study prior to the book, and of the local ones, and the ones that I could find, and that was true in the study. Um, Now, I that could well change, because the category homosexual, male to female, transsexual is not set in stone, and it changes with culture. In some cultures, it doesn't really exist, and it may be changing now, because unlike when I wrote my book, there is a population of largely progressive families who are socially transitioning their very feminine boys early in life. there's a big study, not, I mean, pretty big study over, well over 100 people, uh, being conducted by Christina Olson, now at Princeton University. She used to be at University of Washington. These are, families, mothers mainly, who have allowed their very feminine boys to become to live as girls. And I would predict that eventually most of these boys will they will medically transition, because I don't know what will make them stop, because they really do want to be girls. And what will they also work as sex workers? Well, I don't know that. Maybe not, because the ones that I knew that came from kind of poor, lower class, often minority families, these are, middle class, upper middle class, largely white families, progressive, very different backgrounds. So also, these days, in if you can get it, uh, a lot of the youth will go on puberty blockers. And it wouldn't surprise me if puberty blockers change sexual psychology, long-term sexual psychology among those who receive them. So it may reduce the propensity for males, and that doesn't just include trans women, but also just plain old men, to be interested in casual sex. So again, in conclusion, it wouldn't surprise me if things change. But back when I was writing, uh, I uh, I don't, even in retrospect, know of evidence that contradicted what I wrote. It did make some people mad, especially uh, trans women who identified as homosexual, transsexuals, and didn't like that. Now, that doesn't mean that they were homosexual, transsexuals, because some uh, trans women who identify as the homosexual subtype are not. Some of them are autogynephilic, but identifying as homosexual because for various reasons, including it's less stigmatized, and it's considered, I don't know, more desirable in certain ways to be that kind.
In 2003, you wrote that public statements by those who call themselves transgendered, who are almost all autogynephiles rather than homosexual transsexuals, that is, they're the spokesman of the movement, rarely acknowledge any erotic component of transgenderism. And since then, some of them have broken the silence and taken it back. You had Julia Serrano admits to this erotic component of his transition, and then, gruffly denies the existence of HEP. You have Jamie Shoup, who in a moment of lucidity is able to acknowledge his HEP and then, loses his mind again. And then you have Andrea Longshu, who's explicit uh, and has raised his own controversies that way. And now you have Phil Illy, who would popularize this or make us aware, I suppose, in his own way. So you do have a growing awareness of it. And after 22 years, do you think the public is ready for this conversation, or is ready to have it constructively? Or do you think that the activists are just going to, set things on fire every time?
Well, there's activists and there's activists. I mean, now we have activists, the transgender activists who will try to set it on fire. There's also activists on the opposing side, who I would call gender critical activists. Not all gender critical people, and I think I would have be counted as gender critical by a lot of people, but I'm certainly not a gender critical activist, but there are those who are very hostile toward all autogynephiles, even including those who have tried to lead good lives and are not trying to trans the children and invade women's spaces. But there's a faction that seems to be arguing that the only good autogynephile is uh, one who'd never been born. And I don't agree with that. I know plenty of good and worthy autogynephiles who know a lot about the science. I interact with uh, many of them on Twitter. And I think that the best outcome, and I don't know how hopeful I am right now, but the best outcome would be an allyship between uh, self-aware and good and open autogynephiles who who are not uh, anti-women and the gender critical. I think that they could do a lot of good together. I also want to remind people that every autogynephile comes from a family, including a mother and a father, and a lot of the gender critical with who have male gender dysphoric children, at least some of them have autogynephilic kids, whether or not they want to admit it. And it would be good for everybody not to demonize all autogynephiles. Believe me, I have been attacked more than anybody else. I feel quite certain and worse by delusional and angry autogynephiles. I have no affection for them and am very happy to identify them and call them out. But I think that there are a lot of good ones too. And I don't think we should demonize them.
As a matter of assigning responsibility, I blame feminism for exactly half of the transgender problem. Exactly half. Liberal feminism in particular. Why do you blame feminism for this present gender madness, and to what extent?
You know, I'll start with the most general and important way, and that is that feminism is an ideology. It's not uh, associated with careful critical thinking. It's associated with blaming men for stuff. You know, I guess we have to be careful what we do and don't mean by feminism. If feminism means thinking women are just as worthy as men and that they shouldn't be discriminated in against, rather, just because they're women, then I'm a feminist. But I don't think that's what is typically meant. Feminism has uh, more often been understood to emphasize the unfairness of life for those born female, uh, and that definitely happens. There's also unfairness that happens for being born male. There, neither sex has a monopoly on being victims or unfairness. Uh, but so I think that what has been needed in the transgender crisis, it's more than one really, but I'll just say crisis for now, has been clear thinking. That's what's been absent. and I haven't seen that much of it by uh, radical feminists, and I've not seen much of it by progressive uh, allies of transgender activists either. Transgender activists have actually been the opposite of clear thinking. They've tried to suppress clear thinking. And I suppose that uh, radical feminists who oppose transgender, they haven't really been trying to suppress uh, thinking. Uh, Although I have recently experienced increased hostility, say on Twitter, from some uh, who seem to be radical feminists. And, I was taken aback because, again, I've done a lot to restore sanity and to oppose the transgender crisis. From, even though Ray Blanchard came up with uh, the theory of autogynephilia, I think I've done more than anybody else to publicize it at great personal cost. I have studied rapid onset gender dysphoria uh, and have, been, my work has been suppressed and I fought back and I publicized it. I have testified in the United States recently against, well, I've testified for the side uh, outlawing medical transition of minors. Um, and I've tried to think clearly as a scientist. I will, I want to say that scientists have the obligation to be careful and to consider all sides of an issue. That doesn't mean that they think all sides are equally um, correct, but they need to think about them. And my influence as a scientist, my trustworthiness depends on my being willing to consider different sides before, making a decision which side I think is the most likely to be true. Uh, but I've been attacked on Twitter recently for using female pronouns to talk about trans women, the phrase trans women. And I noticed you seem to be using male pronouns for transgender natal males. I notice I didn't correct you, even though I don't use the same practice, uh, and you didn't correct me yet. I think, and I don't think we have trouble understanding what we're talking about. There are more important issues, like uh, what is true and what is the best way to deal with transgender people.
You clearly don't want to stigmatize AGP. You say in your book that a better solution is to disagree with those who stigmatize male femininity. It is a false and shallow diversity that allows only differences that cannot be observed. You argued in 2003 for the inclusion of feminine men in society as men, like Phil Illy using the men's room at GenSpect, right? He's wearing a blue dress, but
Uh,
he's using the men's room.
let me interrupt. That I was not thinking of, not, and I don't think I was writing about autogynephilic males when I wrote about feminine men, because I don't think of autogynephilic men as feminine. Uh, I suppose they're wearing women's clothes, and some, if they get you know medical treatments to that end, then they are feminized in a certain way. But I was mostly writing about the other kind of not only trans women but male. So gay men, for example, on average, they are feminine. Back when I wrote that, especially, and for a long time before that, feminine men were highly stigmatized and picked on. And I thought that was bad. Now, we've made progress for that subgroup since then. For example, the television show, which was a big hit, Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. That was a bunch of gay men who were feminine in different ways and had mad skills that were, on average, more typical of women. And so that's what I was mainly writing about. But I also, so I think stigmatization of autogynephilia comes mainly from the fact that it is an unusual sexuality that these people were born with, I think, uh, and can't change, I think. And I don't see much good coming from stigmatizing that sexuality. I would propose instead that we stigmatize autogynephilic persons who act badly to satisfy their autogynephilia or their other needs. And that would include, for example, trans activists who try to attack Kelly J. Keene because she says things they don't like. That's awful. Uh, it includes you know a probably a very small minority of transgender persons, but I think they probably are disproportionately autogynephilic who wind up in women's prisons and perhaps do bad things there. Um, yeah, and I think that there is this subgroup of autogynephiles who are in denial. They're autogynephilic. If we knew enough about their personal history, it would be obvious that they were. Uh, Now, being in denial isn't necessarily damaging to other people, but it's certainly misleading. And I wish more people would be honest about autogynephilia.
So let's address some of the stigma. Uh, First of all, there's this argument that pornography is involved usually in AGP identification or ideation. And my own reading of experiences of AGP is that, yeah, porn usually shows up, it plays a role, but you never know where it's coming from. There was an unfortunate kid on the GenSpect podcast a couple of months ago uh, who said that his trigger was watching a Jack Black movie. I mean, come on. Anything can cause this ideation. Okay, so porn plays a role, but there is the argument that porn uh, consumption will affect the brain, that it will change the male brain. What do you say to people who wave, a study um, and say that porn consumption affects the brain, for example? What response do you have to that argument?
Uh, so let's back up a little. First, um, pornography figures in the large majority of male sexuality in the sense that they sometimes view pornography. Most straight men view some straight pornography. uh, either a heterosexual couple having very graphic sex or perhaps two women having sex. The large majority of gay men uh, use pornography occasionally, featuring men having sex with each other. Uh, do we think that gay men become gay, say, because they view gay pornography? I don't. Our does when I was a kid, uh, we didn't have the internet, but I certainly at some point saw Playboy centerfolds, which I found pretty sexy and I guess sexually arousing. Did that make me straight? I don't think that's the way it works. People have these sexual interests and they uh, kind of select into the kind of pornography that they like based on their sexual interests. And that is recently we have unpublished data. This is a study I actually conducted in collaboration with Phil Illy and somebody else uh, survey. And we ask about the genre sissy hypnoporn, which seems to be, one of the, I guess, the pornography that is alleged to cause autogynephilia in some cases. And uh, among the uh, men in our sample, or the persons, the males who identified as autogynephilic, well, yeah, a lot of them, most of them had viewed sissy hypnoporn and found it, somewhat uh, arousing, but not, tremendously so. Uh, but on average, they had experienced autogynephilia about 5 years before they ever saw any of this kind of porn. So, which makes sense to me because it's not the porn that causes the autogynephilia. It's that the autogynephilic interest uh, responds to that kind of pornography, which they eventually found. I have I don't think that I have ever uh, seen sissy hypno porn, even though I study this stuff. Uh, and my it's I don't spend any time uh, uh, seeking out porn, but I have in the past for uh, you know finding sexual stimuli to use in the studies, for example, and never saw sissy hypno porn. So in terms of pornography changing the brain, I am aware of a 2014 study arguing for that, and I am very skeptical of those results for two reasons. First of all, the statistically significant finding that they highlight clearly comes from an analysis where they looked at lots of different parts of the brain, and that's what they found. That kind of analysis is known to generate uh, false positives, that is, lucky findings that will not replicate. There has been a replication crisis in all of science, including neuroscience, maybe especially neuroscience, and especially the intersection of neuroscience and psychology. So, first of all, I'm not, I would bet against that finding replicating. Second, even if it did, and this is something the authors of that study admitted as well, we don't know what the direction of causation is. Is it that watching porn caused that brain finding, or is it that people with some propensity to become sexually aroused by porn, especially guys who especially like porn, had some brain difference in to begin with, and they must, there is, I'm sure, an individual difference such that some men really, really like porn and some men uh don't like it, you know, at all. And we have this wide range with probably most men kind of toward the middle. And that must reflect the brain. That's where we get our feelings and interests from. And most traits like that have a strong genetic component, and the environmental component is really kind of random. We know very few things that uh, in which a stable trait is caused by an identifiable experience like watching porn.
Are there any neurological studies of autogynephilia?
Not yet. Let me distinguish uh, two kinds of neurological studies. I would say neuroscience studies. One would be structural, in which either using uh, autopsied brains, so people have to die, donate their brains, or looking at parts of the brain in a structural brain image. These are usually comparing sizes of particular parts of the brain. And if it's brain autopsied studies, you can get into some pretty interesting and potentially important areas. But unfortunately, you can never get large enough samples of people who've donated their brains, especially people with autogynephilia who've donated their brains. So those studies really, I think almost none of them is true and replicable. And there have been lots on, there have been several, let's say, on transsexuals published so far, but none of those talked about autogynephilia per se. But regardless, even if they had, I wouldn't believe their findings. The other is a type that I have conducted on typical sexual orientation, that is homosexual and heterosexual men and women. And this is functional magnetic imaging, or fMRI. It's a person lays in a scanner and does something. In our case, it was look at pictures of attractive naked men and women, say. That was one of the things we had them do. And we saw how their brain responded. And we definitely found things in that study that we expected to find, that replicated patterns of findings that we got in our genital arousal patterns. So that was quite reassuring in various ways. Uh, Nobody has done that kind, and if it's a large enough effect, which we had, because uh, you know, the kind of sexual stimuli that a straight man or a gay man look at and respond to, that is a naked woman versus a naked man, that's a big effect. Very different in straight men and gay men. We can find big effects in fMRI studies. And I could imagine uh, designing a study that might work uh, with autogynephilic males. However, the added value of that kind of study over and above a genital arousal study, which we can conduct, uh, you know, much more cheaply, I think is low. The kind of study that everybody wants is the first type, the structural, And it's just not feasible right now to do something that we both trust uh, and is going to be interesting with respect to autogynephilia.
So, if you had unlimited resources to study autogynephilia, what sort of studies would you run? I mean, Blanchard left this field 30 years ago in a normal research environment with a normal topic. People would have built on his work or else proven him wrong by now. So, what is your perfect study like?
Well, there's no going to be no perfect study, but some of the things that are studyable and I would like to study would include, um, for example, studying the genital arousal patterns of uh, transgender males who say that they're not autogynephilic, but who otherwise fit the pattern. That is, they're not homosexual. They're not exclusively male attracted. And we had this discovery that autogynephilic males respond to she-male stimuli, and my prediction would be that we would get a similar pattern in transgender males uh, who say, uh, "I'm not autogynephilic," and that would, um, I guess, support my suspicion that, in fact, they probably are autogynephilic. I'm just not saying that they are. So that'd be one thing. I wish we knew more about how prevalent autogynephilia is. There was one study conducted in Sweden that was a large epidemiological study, and I think that they found that 3% of males uh, admitted that they had ever been sexually aroused by uh, cross-dressing. Uh, and, you know, I've always thought that was maybe too high. And they only asked the one question. It would be uh, good to know what proportion of males had those feelings. One thing that is urgently needed is to try to understand among autogynephilic men what distinguishes those who are driven to transition and have intense gender dysphoria and those who do not. And is there anything we can do to help gender dysphoric autogynephilic males experience less gender dysphoria?
In other words, alleviating the symptoms.
Yep, yep.
Yeah, interesting. Um, you write in your book that basically this is what I'm taking from it, that gaydar, right, the sort of um, sense of whether a person might be a homosexual, specifically a male person, it's a heuristic. It's faster than cognition because you have to interrogate yourself in one scene of this book to figure out how you knew that a man was likely to be gay without even thinking about it first. You realized it and then you thought about it. So what I take from that is that you're saying we're actually evolved to recognize feminine men.
So in graduate school, I had these friends uh, who I thought liked each other, and they were I thought they would make a good couple. And I actually said that to another friend, and he said, "What are you talking about? He's gay." and and in retrospect, I developed good gaydar, but I didn't realize it at the time. Uh, and I was always very fond of Paul Lynde on the Hollywood squares. He was always in the middle and a flamboyantly gay man. I didn't know why I liked him or thought he was funny or whatever, but his persona was part of that. So you know, I think maybe some learning is involved, but once you once you have your eyes open, it's pretty easy.
You have changed your mind on the existence of male bisexuality. That's an interesting story about data. So, can you just tell us about that?
Among men only. There's been skepticism about the existence of male bisexuality. Gay men who I knew told me this joke, I guess, among the gay men say, you're either gay, straight, or lying. And meaning that men who call themselves bisexual were likely lying because they were gay and not ready to admit it. And that, why did they say that? Well, part of the reason why they said that is because they knew from experience, because a lot of men who ultimately come out as gay do go through a stage of identifying as bisexual. Why would they do that? I guess, you know, a lot of them find it easier to go from, you know, they often start off identifying as straight, but they know that's not quite true, or they and it's easier for them to tell people, well, I like girls, but I also like boys too, and ultimately identifying as gay. And when we've done a study asking men who went through that trajectory, well, when you were identifying as bisexual, were you really bisexual? And they said no. And they are not men who went through that trajectory are not uh, aroused by women in the lab. But you know, there are men who live bisexual lives and have sexual relationships with men and with women. Uh, we were interested in studying and documenting, I guess, that some men have bisexual arousal patterns. Well, what does that mean? In the lab, we would show men male stimuli, that is, erotic videos, what we used, featuring only men, so that if they got aroused by it, we would know what aroused them. We would also show them erotic stimuli featuring only women. And if somebody has a truly bisexual arousal pattern, they may not get equally aroused by both male and female sexual stimuli, but they would get at least somewhat aroused to both of them. And in our first study of this, published in 2005, to great fanfare, we got into the New York Times about it and so on. We found no evidence for that men who identified as bisexual had a bisexual arousal pattern. They mostly look like gay men. But we you know, it's one thing to say we found no evidence for it. It's another thing to say we showed that bisexuality did not exist among men, and I never said that. And we kept studying this. In part, we kept studying it because of an extraordinary man named John Silla, who is the head of the American Institute for Bisexuality, who did not like our 2005 study. He contacted me. We had lengthy discussions, and he offered to fund a follow-up study, uh, providing that they could have some say in the design of the study, not the results. Obviously, we found what we found, and not how we wrote it up, but in the design. And we did a couple of things different. We advertised for our subjects in a different sort of way. We had different inclusion criteria. We recruited men in a way that the men who were in the bisexual group had, they had serious evidence of bisexuality. They had histories of lengthy sexual relationships with both men and with women, for example. And in that study, which was published in 2011, we did find evidence for that some bisexual men had bisexual arousal patterns. And we kept collecting data still. And finally, in 2020, we conducted an analysis of all the data we'd ever collected, which included more than 400 men that we had lab arousal patterns on. We showed without a doubt that some men who identified as bisexual tended to have bisexual arousal patterns. As a scientist, I have no problem changing my mind if that's what the data say, and the data definitely had me change my mind from what I believed was true in 2005.
So what about autoandrophilia? This is a controversial topic, whether the trans man has autoandrophilia. Is there a way to prove this exists other than reported experience? You have questioned how to prove it exists or whether there's evidence for it. So can you just sort of talk about that?
I have various reasons for doubting that autoandrophilia exists as something that is analogous to autogynephilia. I know that some uh, females, and mainly females who've been gender dysphoric, have reported experiencing autoandrophilia, and uh, you know, quite possibly they have experienced something uh, that we would agree uh, is sexual arousal by thinking of themselves as a man. Uh, Quite possibly. Uh, However, you know, first, um, based on studying just plain old sexual orientation, there are very important differences between the expression of male and female sexual orientation, with male orientation being much more focused and intense and immutable, let's say, than female sexual orientation. Second, males definitely have paraphilias. Whether females do is uh, not settled in my mind, even though in any paraphilia study I've done, some women say they self-report that they have this. I mean, or it's maybe 10 to 15% of the samples we collect are natal females. But I'm not ready to say that those women in the sample have the same thing that the men in the sample have. We we know that autogynephilia is seems to emerge spontaneously in adolescence and motivates gender dysphoria in a subset of males. We do not know that autoandrophilia emerges spontaneously and that it is a motivator of gender dysphoria. I think it could be a byproduct. If a female is attracted to men and somehow she catches gender dysphoria, note my language, catches gender dysphoria, she may have this feeling that well, I like men. Thinking about myself as a man, that's kind of arousing. I'm not saying that that's true. I'm not saying I know that that's true. That's a possibility. Um, so Phil Illy has become, I would say, almost an activist promoting autoandrophilia. I certainly don't think, and I like Phil. We collaborate. We've collaborated on a study, but I don't like what he's done in this domain. Uh, he's not acting like a scientist. He, he's acting like somebody who's promoting an idea. I think the evidence is much weaker than Phil thinks. Uh, Also, Ray Blanchard, when he worked at a gender clinic, uh, he, everybody who wanted sex reassignment surgery, both male and female, came to that clinic if they wanted paid for by Ontario. He saw plenty of female to male transsexuals. He is the one who came up with the idea of autogynephilia. Of course, he was wondering, well, does this exist in natal females? He never found evidence for it. What are the chances that Phil Illy is going to discover something based on reading blogs or not, I guess uh, discussion boards by gender dysphorics uh, that Ray Blanchard did not discover? I think the odds are very low. Phil does not seem to me to be sufficiently concerned about the epidemic of gender dysphoria among natal females, which I think a lot of that is due to social contagion and suggestion. And this is a population where that's known for having these kinds of epidemics. Go back to the 90s, and we have multiple personality disorder and recovered memories of sexual abuse. Um, I Phil doesn't seem to be at all worried that you know they acquire these ideas by suggestion. Well, I am worried. So I don't know a study that is going to be able to uh, definitively decide whether autoandrophilia exists in the way that autogynephilia does. Uh, and, you know, that's often the case among scientists. They don't know how to answer a question. So they try different things and eventually evidence accumulates. And that's probably the way it's going to have to happen. Phil doesn't seem to be as interested in accumulating evidence to persuade people by as coming up with testimonials that he finds on the internet.
The latest study you've arranged with Lisa Littman and Ken Zucker is controversial. Um, Questions about gender dysphoria and sexuality will make people uncomfortable, especially parents. Uh, but can you clarify for the record about, for example, whether this is IRB approved? There are some claims that the experiment is unethical somehow. Can you address the concerns that surround your role in this study?
The study that I'm collaborating with Lisa Littman and Ken Zucker on was originally proposed by Ken Zucker, uh, I think maybe 6 years ago now. Uh, and it was to identify adolescent gender dysphorics and follow them up, see how they turned out, and especially the new cohort of uh, females whose gender dysphoria begins during adolescence. That's the one that is then most closely linked to the hypothesis of ROGD. And the purpose of the study is to recruit families, which could be either parents reporting on their gender dysphoric youth or the youth themselves. We have a very detailed initial questionnaire, and then we intend to follow them up over several years, we hope, to see various things, to see what decisions they make and how those affect their happiness. And we think that it's a very important study, that parents and gender dysphoric youth will be very interested in our results. This, I said that the study was originally proposed, I think it was 2018 or maybe 2019. Ken proposed it to me. And we just started it this spring. And a lot of that delay was a tremendous amount of work getting it approved by two IRBs, two, Northwestern and another one. It was very carefully vetted by those IRBs. We had to make many changes. We understand that there are some European families who are concerned that very young people, and I think that we in the United States, we're able to allow 13-year-olds to enter the study. And some people in Europe think that's too young. And as a result of their concerns, we have stopped for now recruiting youth into our study in Europe. And we are changing the minimum age to conform to their preferences. If they're below a certain age, they will have to get parental permission. So we have listened to these parents, and we have made the changes that they request. So we hope that they will no longer be concerned. So we think it's going to be a really important study. We're excited about it. It's desperately needed, and nobody else, to our knowledge, is doing anything like it.
You wrote in 2003 of internalized femophobia or sissyphobia, that femininity has been punished so often by the straight world that gay men too come to hate it. That femophobia, or else that femophobia is not due to social intolerance, but is intrinsic to male homosexuality and is not remediable even by reforming straight society to make it less homophobic. I wonder about the term Gareth Roberts uses in the title of his book, Gay Shame, because that's what he's referring to there. Across time and space, gay men desiring masculine men, and the acknowledgement of their own femininity, it makes them feel undesirable. It's shame. And now you have an argument with Joe Burgo, who is writing about counselees that he has who are autogynephiles, and shame is playing a role in their identification, he says. So, can you just outline the ongoing debate you're having with him about this? Because I think it's very interesting. It's science.
Let me clarify what you just said. So I am a scientist. Joe Burgo is not. He's a psychoanalyst who has seen a few cases in therapy and come up with some opinions filtered through his psychoanalytic framework, which is not itself scientific. So Joe Burgo thinks that autogynephilia results from something he calls core shame, which is a by his story, it begins in youth, and somebody develops deep shame about their lives which could originate for different reasons, like having a bad family, or gosh, I think it might even be able to come out of the blue. And somehow, in ways that he does not articulate, and he admits that he can't articulate it, that gets transformed into a teenager's sexual excitement about wearing panties and a bra. I don't think that that is true, or and I don't think it's a helpful framework for understanding autogynephilia. Uh, and I've encouraged Joe Burgo rather, to test his ideas scientifically. And until then, I'm not really going to take them seriously. Now, something I don't think we got into, but I will say that autogynephilia is paraphilia that is has a fairly strong correlation with another paraphilia, that is masochism. And one aspect of masochism that some masochistic men find uh, sexually arousing is being insulted or humiliated by somebody else, being shamed. Some autogynephiles find, and some masochistic men find being shamed sexually arousing. So that may have influenced his hypotheses, but I don't think that in those cases it is that shame is causing autogynephilia. I think that it is both masochistic, both masochism and autogynephilia originate from some substrate in the brain that makes them likely to have two paraphilias. There is a moderate to strong relationship between autogynephilia and masochism, but there is not a strong association between autogynephilia and some other paraphilias. And the one that should be most concerning, I guess, would be pedophilia. And if there is any association at all between autogynephilia and pedophilia, it's got to be weak, because I've looked for it and haven't found much evidence for it.
You wrote in 2003 about Karl Ulrichs. In 1868, he explained gay men as women's souls in men's bodies. And you sort of play on this in your idea in the title of your book. You play on this idea. The attempt to separate sexuality from gender, you say, has been especially misleading for transsexualism. Supposedly, male to female transsexuals are motivated solely by the deep-seated feeling that they have women's souls. Now, that's the transsexual explaining himself.
Let me tell you about a finding from the study I have told you about in collaboration with Phil Illy. So again, this is a sample of what we call gender variant males, some of whom they vary in their ultimate intentions of whether they're going to transition or not. Some already have transitioned, even medically. And we wrote a scale that I call transgender ideology. So let me just tell you some of the items on it. Uh, Trans women are women, agree or not. Um, uh, Transgender activists have been a force for good. Trans women should be allowed to play sports with uh, natal females. Uh, J.K. Rowling is a transphobe. You get the idea? Uh, so those are all items on this scale. That scale, scores on that scale, predict whether a gender variant male wants to transition, intends to transition. Furthermore, it does so even statistically holding constant their degree of gender dysphoria. So, in other words, transgender ideology seems to uh, be related to how people choose to live their lives. And not everybody has transgender ideology to the same extent.
Interesting. So the ideology kind of takes over as the sacrament. Um, we've noticed, for example, in TikTok reels, you get these people using hermetic scripts. You get young people, young women who've cut off their breasts and they're having their trans right, RITE, of going to the beach or the pool topless for the first time. It's like this sort of pseudo religious effect is happening. So you're saying that there is actually evidence that the ideology sort of propels people towards medicalized transition, is what you're saying. Do I get that correct?
Um, so, yeah, I would say there's evidence for that. I don't think that the evidence is conclusive because it's a cross-sectional survey and, people can quibble, I guess, about, how do I know that the X causes Y rather than some other kind of causal model. I don't, but it's the causal model that makes the most sense to me. There's certainly evidence for it. And I'm going to tell you this will be the first time I've said this publicly. I'm going to write more about this, but who is relatively low on this transgender ideology scale?
Who?
Self-aware autogynephilic males.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so they're not really the ideologues.
Well, that's right. And they're also relatively low on their intentions to transition. So to me, that's another piece of evidence why gender criticals should try to ally with self-aware autogynephilic males.
Well, that's a big challenge you've just made to a movement. And I endorse the conversation here. I'm sure that lots of people are going to get very angry when they hear it, and that's a good thing. It's good for people to disagree and to grind out these culture war sort of issues.
What can I just suggest that they maybe disagree strongly, but try to do it without getting angry at me or anybody, because let's it's a waste of everybody's emotional resources. Let's talk about ideas, and if they have evidence that I'm wrong, I'm happy to hear it. If they just don't like what I say, well, I'm not sure what to do about that because I'm not saying it to make them angry. I'm saying it because that's what the data say as best I can interpret it. So let's try to be less angry and have more constructive discussions.
Dr. John Michael Bailey, thank you for your time today. You've been very generous.
Thank you.